Well, good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to have you all with us this evening. Many supporters and friends and members of council, senior fellows, regents, the Pro-Chancellor of both our own university and the Pro-Chancellor of Liverpool University. It's wonderful to have you, and especially to welcome today the family of Professor George Mair. There's a whole Mair clan here tonight, which is wonderful, but this is a success to be celebrated not just by individuals and academics, but certainly by families and friends. May I also give a special welcome to our colleagues from Liverpool John Moores. I gather there's a goodly number here to support Professor Mair from his former university. So a special welcome then to our colleagues from John Moores. We keep this Senate room for special occasions like the meeting of Senate, for inaugural lectures, and for a few other special things. It is for those visitors to the campus. It is the one place you'll get a glimpse of our 19th century roots. It's not always known that our first college was established in 1844 and the second in 1856. But if you come to this one room, you'll see some signs of that. That 19th century organ up on the loft, still functioning and in good nick, and often is used here. But on the windows, you'll notice, I'm told this is the only chapel in England where all the saints in the windows are women. I'm also told that these pieces were in the original chapel in 1844, put in there, and then in the late 19th century, when the fire affected that chapel, some brave and wonderful soul protected these pieces and had them put in when this university was established here in 1930. So another sign of our 19th century roots, and I'm still struggling to find out which person actually had the foresight to go out and protect those glass pieces for us. But there they are. So welcome to the Senate room of the university, and welcome this evening. Now, I should also say that the university doesn't appoint professors hastily. They appoint them to lead departments. All our departments are led by professors. And we have traditional departments here because the disciplines inform departments. And we picked them carefully, and we appointed Professor Mair to restart what was once a very successful department, which then, with the loss of numbers, closed down in the 90s. And we've re-established the Department of Sociology. And we appointed Professor Mair to lead this department, which houses both sociology and criminology. Professor Mair, as you'll hear just now when Professor Newport introduces him, is a leading expert, one of only 4 in this particular area in the world, I'm told, leading in the area he's going to speak to us about. So it's a great joy then to invite you here tonight and to give Professor Mair a chance to put out his stall and to have colleagues from across the university hear what this professor will profess here at Hope. So welcome everybody, and may I invite Professor Newport to introduce our speaker.
Well, this evening, Professor Mair formally takes up the inaugural chair in Hope's new Department of Social Science. The creation of this new department is one of the outcomes of a root and branch review of the university's academic portfolio that took place 2 years ago now. The review was itself part of a much wider process of institutional transition, a little bit of which you've been hearing about already, as Hope has moved from being, first of all, a set of independent colleges, then to an institute of higher education, then to a university college, and finally to a university. And that's where we are in our progress here at Hope. We are building for the future. This evening, therefore, we're marking not only the taking up of a new chair, but also the creation of a new department, and thereby the further strengthening and securing of the university as a whole. another pillar of the supporting structure of this institution is being put in place, and we are adding significantly to our big project. Professor Mair was born and brought up in Llangriggend, I do hope I've pronounced that not too incorrectly, in North Lanarkshire. He was the first of his family to go to university, studying at the University of Glasgow, where Professor Mair began a degree in English literature and history. At the end of the first year, bored with his history course, which was largely a repetition of what he'd done in his hires, that's his words and not mine, I hasten to add, and fired by the idea coming out of the French student movement that the world could be changed, again his words and not mine, Professor Mair switched to a degree in sociology, and I have to confess that I had not realized that, like philosophers, it seems sociologists take the view that the task of the discipline is not simply to understand the world, but to change it. After graduating in 1973 with an MA honours degree, Professor Mair moved to the University of Strathclyde to take up an SSRC-sponsored studentship to work on an MSc, the result of which was a dissertation with the title Towards a Sociology of Shopping. Professor Mair then moved to St. David's University College, Lampeter, as it was at that time, to act as a research officer for another SSRC-funded project on the survival of the small shop in urban Britain. And by this time, says Professor Mair, he was becoming a little anxious about his now extensive involvement in shopping research. And when the study was completed, he moved to London to take a different direction, working first as a research officer in the DHSS Social Research Branch before moving to the Home Office as a senior research officer. It was while in London that, building upon what was now a growing interest in criminology, that Professor Mair enrolled on a PhD at the London School of Economics. In the same year as completing his PhD, he was promoted to Principal Research Officer at the Home Office and began working on probation research, an area in which he has spent much of his professional life ever since. His status as a researcher was recognized and confirmed when in 1995 Professor Mair became Professor of Criminal Justice within the School of Law at Liverpool John Laws University. Professor Mair has around 100 publications to his name, including 5 books, with a further 2 volumes due for publication later this year. He is co-founder and co-editor of the journal Criminology and Criminal Justice, which is now the official journal of the British Society of Criminology. Currently, apart from trying to organise the birth of the Department of Social Science here at Liverpool Hope, Professor Mair is working on a comparative study of media representations of probation. He is also organising a meeting of the European Working Group on Community Sanctions and Measures, which will take place here at the university at the end of this month. A varied and impressive CV then, and one which traces the career of a distinguished researcher whose first post in higher education, if I'm not mistaken, was that of professor, a rare achievement indeed. And so we're delighted to have Professor Mair with us, and through him to take forward our vision for a Department of Social Science that will bring into the heart of the university a valued and practically relevant area of human inquiry, scholarship informing practice for the betterment of society. Now that is something to which Hope is instinctively committed. And so it's a great pleasure now to invite Professor Mair to deliver to us his inaugural lecture on the topic, it's going to be a difficult trip I think, the end days of the probation service, ? Professor Mair.
Thanks very much indeed for everybody attending, and thank you, Professor Newport, for your kind words. I also owe various people some thanks as well. I'd particularly like to thank my new colleagues at Hope for making me very welcome indeed since my arrival here in September. Rather more specifically, I really do owe a serious debt of thanks to the staff who make up the Department of Social Work, Care and Justice, where I'm currently located, because they've been exceptionally supportive and helpful in helping me settle down. I'm also very grateful to the friends who've turned up today, some from a fair distance. Thanks very much for making the effort to come along. Finally, I just mentioned my children, Ruth and Ethan, who always make life more interesting and enjoyable, at the very least. That's the least one can say about them. And lastly, I'd like to say thank you very much indeed to my wife, Carmel, whose patience, support and kindness seem at times to be infinite. Those of you who were privileged enough to be here last month for Professor Lavallette's inaugural lecture will have heard a very passionate and rousing address, which I certainly felt was in many ways peculiarly Scottish. But what you're going to get this evening, I'm afraid, is another facet of the Scottish character. It's very much Celtic gloom and doom. Various people have asked if there are going to be any jokes, and I'm afraid I was brought up as a dour Presbyterian, and jokes have no laughing matter at all where I come from. The title of the talk is actually a quotation from a chief probation officer whom I interviewed 12 years ago. I was carrying out a fairly extensive study of the biographies, careers, what was going on in probation, interviewing all chief probation officers. And it's surprising, looking back, just how few of them, in fact, none of them, had any kind of pessimistic view. The worst I could find was one chief officer who talked about the future as being a difficult trip, I think. The probation service has been operating in England and Wales now for more than 100 years, and it's very difficult indeed, I think, to envisage the criminal justice system without it. But given a whole number of wide-ranging developments over the past 30 or 40 years, it seems increasingly likely that the service has no serious future as a major criminal justice agency. Yet, probation lies at the very heart of the criminal justice process. It's been involved in crime prevention, it's been involved with the police in multi-agency public partner arrangements, it developed and staffed bail information schemes, it provides reports to the courts, without which sentencing would be a much more hit-and-miss affair. It organises and operates the two key sentences that currently exist, the community order and the suspended sentence order. It has a presence in every prison in the country, and it works with released prisoners on licence. And it also works with the victims of serious crime. It deals with more offenders than the prison service. It deals with them more cheaply, and it deals with them at least as effectively. It's recently been meeting all of its Ministry of Justice imposed targets, yet most of this work is completely hidden from public view. But it's absolutely essential to the smooth and efficient running of the criminal justice process. So how has it become possible to imagine the disappearance of probation and what it does? It's only a few years now since the service celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2007. But even then it was possible to discern serious threats and undercurrents, although in the overall context of celebration, these were either completely ignored or marginalised. And it's all too easy to place the blame for the current state of probation on the present government, and they're certainly not blameless, that's for sure. But this is to misunderstand the nature of the problem. And what I want to do this evening is to examine just how what seems to be this terminal decline has actually come about. A Whig history of probation would interpret it quite simply as a narrative of success, albeit a success that's been achieved on the margins, and if you take account of the full 100-year history, it's not always been easily done. Probation's grown in size, it's widened its responsibilities, and it's taken on more tasks. But it would be naive to accept the success narrative at face value. Probation's growth and development has been fragmented, inconsistent, badly planned, if indeed it could be said to be planned at all, and it's been subject to political whim. Probation's localism, for most of its history seen unequivocally as a virtue, has meant that it's all too often lacked an effective national voice. Historically, its three main such voices, the Central Council for Probation Committees, the Association of Chief Officers of Probation, and the National Association of Probation Officers, rarely, if ever, spoke together, representing, as they did, three very different constituencies. Probation's faith that it was on the side of the angels and that its staff were the good guys of the criminal justice system meant that it tended to be somewhat complacent, at times even rather smug. And a good deal of research has actually been complicit in this. Criminologists, for example, have never subjected probation to the same levels of critique that the police, prison officers or sentencers have had to face. The probation service ignored the question of effectiveness for far too long, relying instead on a simplistic belief that the public and the government would recognise that it was doing good work with bad people, and that was its own justification. It also meant that probation staff had very clear-cut and rather strong views about what they did. And this could lead to a principled opposition to many new initiatives: community service, probation day centres, bail information schemes, electronic monitoring, drug testing of offenders. These are just some of the examples that spring to mind. Now, serious questions certainly needed to be asked about these and various other initiatives, but at times, probation's opposition to them seemed willful and demonstrating a reluctance to come to terms with innovative practices. While you can find many examples of probation and government working well together, especially during the first half of its existence, on the whole, you can pick out a degree of distrust that's always been discernible, on both sides, in fact, and this has been growing exponentially, certainly during the last 30 years. All of this doesn't turn success into failure, but it does mean that probation's success has been built on very shaky foundations. And in good times, this may not matter too much, but when the going gets tough, it becomes a very serious problem indeed. For example, from its very beginnings, probation was seen as a soft option. Everyone was aware of this. It was used as a bit of a criticism, but it didn't lead to harsh criticism. This was simply what probation officers did with offenders. For the past 20 years, however, the soft option has been used to attack probation rather viciously. It can't be shrugged off, and much of government's response to probation service in the last 25 years or so has been driven by the perceived need to toughen probation up and make it more punitive. One might also be tempted to question the success story much more seriously when one can very, very easily pick out a narrative of loss. Over the years, probation has lost its responsibilities for juveniles, it's lost civil work, it's lost its social work foundations, it's lost its monopoly position as provider of non-custodial sentences, it's lost its notional independence, and it's lost its local basis. And I'd like to say just a little bit about each of these. Juvenile offenders, for example, were the bread and butter of probation work for more than half the service's history. As recently as 1960, more than half of those placed on probation orders were under the age of 17, and just over a quarter were under the age of 14. But the rise of local authority social services departments during the 60s meant that the criminal supervision of juvenile offenders began to shift away from probation. And by the beginning of the 80s, only around 10% of those supervised by probation were juveniles, and that figure continued to drop, so juveniles disappeared from the probation agenda. Civil work had been something that probation had been doing, informally at least, since its beginnings. Since 1958, it became a statutory duty of the service, basically doing family court welfare work. As such, this was definitely a social work task, although just how well it fitted into an organisation that primarily worked with offenders is a separate question. By the end of the 90s, probably around 10% of the probation service was devoted to civil work, probably around 1,000 or so staff. But the 2000 Criminal Justice and Court Services Act, which created the National Probation Service, also created the Children and Family Court Advisory Support Service. And those probation officers who'd specialised in family court welfare work joined it for the most part. So probation became a criminal justice agency. Until the late 90s, probation officers were trained as social workers. Home Office initiated training began in 1930. This, of course, being trained as a social worker but working with offenders, only encouraged the soft option tag. But it did mean that whatever you might think about how appropriate social work training was for probation officers who were working with offenders, it did mean that probation officers were provided, because of this training, with a clear rationale and foundation for their work. Social work gave probation a language, a theory, a practice, and a professionalisation when the probation service badly needed these things. In 1996, the then Conservative government suspended probation training arrangements, and when a new training scheme was launched 2 years later by the Labour government, the social work basis had gone. Probation was the monopoly provider of non-custodial sentences for 40 years. In 1948, the introduction of attendance centres ended this monopoly in theory, but in practice, the number of offenders sentenced to attendance centre orders was never enough to trouble probation. Probation had also always made use, from its very beginnings in 1907, always made use of outside groups and agencies in its work. This, however, in the 90s developed into a very clear policy direction that it had to spend a certain percentage of its money on this. And so the promise of partnership working shifted into a threat. And this too chipped away at the service's de facto monopoly. The introduction of new sentences, such as the drug treatment and testing order, and most significantly the curfew order, which came along with electronic monitoring, of course, made even greater inroads into this monopoly. Strictly speaking, probation was never really independent. But when it slowly began to develop a hierarchy in the 1920s as it grew, and principal probation officers were introduced on a piecemeal basis, a sense of independence began to grow and develop. Sentencers, local authorities, all had some degree of input to probation practice, as did the Home Office. But the relative freedom of chief probation officers was actually quite considerable. And probation officers themselves had a great deal of freedom to work with. They could do, virtually within reason, they could deal with offenders in any way they wanted. This was obviously the discretion and autonomy that are part of the hallmark of being a professional. The introduction of the National Probation Service in 2001 ended this notional independence for the service, while national standards, performance indicators, accredited programmes all contributed to the erosion of professional discretion. And finally, loss of the local. From its birth in 1907, probation was a local service based in local magistrates' courts and run by justices of the peace. Over the years, the local base grew as probation areas, under government pressure, amalgamated and became larger. But the locally focused nature of probation remained a key part of the probation myth. Its policy was driven by committees who were made up of local sentencers and members of the local authority. You can actually find consideration about having a centralised or a national service as early as 1910. And the idea crops up in various governmental reports every now and then from then on. In 1984, the Statement of National Objectives and Priorities can be seen as a key moment when the move towards a national service began to build some momentum. And this culminated in 2001, when a national probation service began work. Now, it would be very difficult to try to substantiate any claim that this sustained narrative of loss that I'm talking about was a result of coherent long-term policy planning. Indeed, on the contrary, all of these developments were driven by individual policy decisions by a variety of governments that were never thought through in any rational way, particularly with regard to their long-term implications or their combined impact on the probation service. Equally, it would be unfair to characterise all of these losses as recent developments. They've all got longer-term roots than just the past 3 or 4 years. Alongside this probation-specific history, there are a whole number of rather more general, politically driven issues that have impacted negatively on the probation service. They've hit all sorts of other agencies as well. First, there's the rise of criminal justice policy as a key policy issue. From 1945 till about 1979, criminal justice didn't figure prominently as an issue for successive governments. It simply wasn't a major topic. There were certainly significant criminal justice problems that had to be dealt with. For example, the increase in crime that began in 1955 or so, the rise in the prison population, the existence of capital punishment, but these did not make criminal justice, generally speaking, a hot policy issue. This began with the 1979 general election, following the Who Governs Britain issue that emerged during the second half of the 70s. It's unlikely that any of the criminal justice agencies at the time, police, prisons, courts and probation, actually welcomed the increased scrutiny that accompanied the emergence of criminal justice policy as a policy issue. But probation was probably the least well placed to deal with it. Probation's public persona was shrouded in mystery, and it was used to operating in the back room. It was not used to operating in the full glare of the public. And I always found it very interesting how quickly John Patton's notion of moving probation centre stage died rather quietly. Probation, I don't think, would ever have worked centre stage. Interestingly, the first Association of Chief Officers of Probation survey of public opinion about the probation service, which was carried out in the early 90s, was never published. And it was never published not because public perceptions were uniformly negative. It was never published because embarrassingly few respondents had any idea what probation ever did. Secondly, and following the rise of criminal justice as a significant policy area, is the fact that this almost inevitably led to an increasingly punitive culture. There's no reason at all why more debate about crime and how to deal with it should necessarily lead to increased punitiveness, but that's the direction that we've taken for the last 30 years. Police, courts and prisons can all surprisingly easily clothe themselves in a more punitive rhetoric and follow a more punitive practice. But probation in the 80s found it well nigh impossible to do this. I was in the Home Office when they tried to change the way probation officers talked about their clients to offenders. And that took years, and probation officers found it very, very difficult indeed. Similarly, trying to encourage probation staff to talk about punishment as something they did, rather than welfare or casework or treatment, was a long-term struggle. The service was completely opposed to the introduction of electronic monitoring as overtly punitive, and thereby lost its chance to take control of the initiative. And I certainly think it was a missed opportunity there. It resisted the introduction of drug testing for offenders for as long as it could, until the introduction of drug treatment and testing officers, where a lot of the actual testing was carried out by non-probation staff. Thirdly, there's the disease which I call initiativitis. And this disease first began to appear in the late 80s, early 90s, reached epidemic proportions, indeed pandemic proportions, under the new Labour administrations. And essentially, initiativitis involves introducing one new initiative rapidly after another one, so there's no time at all for the first to settle down, nor is there time for any rigorous evaluation to take place, so essentially the initiative is wasted. Each time, the preceding initiative is judged either implicitly or explicitly as a failure, and the expectations for the succeeding initiative are that much greater. So it's a rather vicious circle you're caught up in. The pressure on public agencies, not surprisingly, becomes more and more intense. And with regard to probation, only two examples will suffice, I think. The first one before initiativitis really became a major problem. The second one when it was in absolutely full flow. So the first one, 1989, there was a very, very significant intensive probation initiative, had been started by the government, and it was being evaluated in a very serious and rigorous way. Lo and behold, 2 years later, the combination order was introduced by the 1991 Criminal Justice Act. Home Office interest in intensive probation collapsed completely. Secondly, and possibly more significant, is the introduction of the National Probation Service in 2001, which led to a radical restructuring of the service, which really required a number of years to allow this reorganisation to settle down and people to assess how it was working, whether or not it was effective or not. In 2004, the National Offender Management Service succeeded the National Probation Service without any detailed planning, and no research was carried out into the effectiveness of either the NPS or NOMS. And in fact, the National Offender Management Service now looks as if it's doomed as well. Fourthly, there's been for almost 30 years now a sustained and continuing attack by successive governments on public service generally, resulting in what David Marquand has termed the decline of the public. And he describes it as follows, and I quote, "The single most important element of the New Right project of the 1980s and 1990s was a relentless Kulturkampf designed to root out the culture of service and citizenship which had become part of the social fabric. Deregulation, privatisation, so-called public-private partnerships, proxy markets, performance indicators mimicking those of the private corporate sector, and a systematic assault on professional autonomy narrowed the public domain and blurred the distinction between it and the market domain. And probation has had to face every one of these issues." The service was specifically on the receiving end of government attacks from the mid-1980s onwards, and at times, probation staff seemed to be demonstrating a degree of paranoia. The thing is, I think you need to remember that just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean to say they're not out to get you. Probation was attacked as being too soft, as having lost the confidence of sentencers, of having the wrong kind of employees, of failing offenders. In 2006, astonishingly, 2 different Home Secretaries openly attacked the service. Charles Clarke saw probation, this was the best one, the dagger at the heart of the criminal justice system, undermining public confidence in criminal justice as a whole. And later that year, his successor John Reid claimed, slightly less aggressively, probation's not working as well as it should. And as I've said, if the service wasn't actually being attacked, it often perceived itself as under attack. Lots of cases could be cited here. The Statement of National Objectives and Priorities, the introduction of national standards, the offender group reconviction scale, government encouragement of partnership working, the introduction of a national probation service. It wouldn't do to go along with claims that these were wholly negative for probation. On the contrary, in most cases they were needed and offered many positives. But their cumulative impact and the way they were introduced by the Home Office only served to heighten probation fears. Now, the argument is certainly not that probation didn't need to change. No organisation can stand still, especially in the face of the political, social, economic and cultural changes that have been underway since the early 1980s. And in an environment that's subject to endemic change, it may well be laudable to try to stand firm in the face of the whirlwind. But at times, probation's resistance to change seems to be folly. It's certainly my opinion that if probation officers had proved to be rather more amenable to some of these changes, and I certainly don't mean by that simply accepting everything that government threw at them, the service wouldn't be in the state it is in now. But that, of course, is speculation. The service generally wasn't terribly well managed. The quality of senior staff varied enormously, and this had implications all across the service, for the way main grade staff were managed, for the way the Home Office was dealt with, and the way in which individual services were organised. It's also, of course, related to inconsistencies in working with offenders. As I've said already, probation officers were traditionally relatively free to use any technique or method that they thought would be useful in working with offenders. So one officer might use one method, while another in the same team might use a completely different one for very similar offenders. In the 1980s, some probation areas went down the probation day centre route in a very big way. They had 2 or 3 centres at least. Others had no day centres at all. Some areas designed risk of custody scales and used them to try to target their disposals more effectively. Some simply took over scales that other areas had developed and started using them without locally validating them, potentially a recipe for disaster. And some didn't use scales at all. Now, this freedom or professional autonomy certainly has its advantages, but it also has its disadvantages. And the most significant of these is that inconsistent practice on the part of probation means a lack of justice for some. And if a justice system is meant to be just, which it seems to me is basically what it's all about, then this is a crucial problem. Closely linked to the issue of of inconsistencies is the matter of effectiveness. Now, measuring the effectiveness of any court sentence is remarkably difficult. Reconviction rates have a huge number of limitations that mean they're probably better utilised as performance indicators rather than a measure of effectiveness. But notwithstanding any methodological problems with the measurement of effectiveness, there is the key question of whether there was actually any reliable evidence to suggest that probation or community service or combination orders was effective. And the answer to this would have to be no. A handful of national reconviction studies and dozens of small, local, for the most part poorly designed evaluations do not provide such evidence. Indeed, a probation inspectorate survey of evaluated programmes in 1996 identified 267 programmes that claimed to have been evaluated. But ultimately, only 4, that's 4 out of 267, were judged to provide some evidence of success. And note the emphasis on some. They did not provide unequivocal evidence of success. Probation had essentially closed its eyes to the question of effectiveness. But what were the responses to these issues of poor management, inconsistent practice, and a lack of evidence and effectiveness? Well, local government started banging in all sorts of things. Increased central control and accountability via performance indicators, targets, financial incentives, managerialism, the development of national standards, a national risk needs assessment score, a joint prison probation accreditation panel, ultimately a national probation service, and the What Works initiative. And while there was nothing particularly wrong about any of these developments, they were pushing probation too far and too fast in a direction that hadn't been carefully planned, hadn't been prepared in any way, and certainly hadn't been thought through. Key performance indicators, for example, began to drive what the service did, as such indicators or targets always tend to do. They distorted the work of the service towards what could be measured and what the Home Office decided were priorities. Financial incentives meant that services who failed to hit their targets lost out on resources instead of gaining resources to help them do their work better. Managerialism was an alien concept to a lot of probation managers, and while some took on its ideas, either fully or partly, others ignored them as best they could. And it's very interesting that just about the time when the height of managerialism was around, just the turn of the new century, half of chief probation officers left the service in 2001. Moves towards consistency were rather more successful, although you couldn't say they were universally welcomed. National standards, for example, were seen as encroaching on the traditional autonomy of the probation officer. A national risk needs assessment scale was seen as ending the clinical judgment of the probation officer and replacing it with actuarial judgment. The accreditation panel was seen by many as tying probation officers' hands. And a national probation service, of course, was anathema to the local traditions of the service. Interestingly, not one of these initiatives was subjected to government-backed research or evaluation to assess its impact. And as for the What Works initiative, which was, of course, supposed to be the answer to everybody's prayers, if this was intended to prove the effectiveness of probation definitively, then it was a complete and unmitigated failure. It certainly provided a lot of information and data, and it had a number of unintended and sometimes very positive consequences, but it did not meet its stated objectives. What Works was, of course, flooded by academic research, but criminologists didn't come out of it at all well. Not only did the various evaluations fail to find demonstrable effects, but the academics themselves have to take some of the blame, because they rushed in very greedily to suck up the huge amounts of government money that was around, knowing full well that the way the projects were being defined was going to lead to all sorts of problems. All of these initiatives were imposed on the service without any planning or regard for possible negative consequences. 2 new sentences were introduced in 2005 to replace all the old orders, the community order and the suspended sentence order. And these have proved to be very successful indeed with the courts, and probation officers seem to appreciate them. Despite the fact that all they are really is old wine in new bottles, they do offer a flexibility that the previous wide range of sentences lacked. And they've rationalised what was essentially a disparate number of sentences and conditions that have been introduced over the past 30, 40 years without any evidence of planning or coordination. But on the downside, there's no evidence at all that either of these sentences is being used to divert offenders from custody. There's no sign of any impact on what's been called the silting up of probation with relatively minor offenders. There's clear evidence that they're being used increasingly punitively, and they may well be contributing to the fragmentation of the probation service. Indeed, from a criminological point of view, the introduction of the suspended sentence order has completely eroded the custody-community divide that once differentiated community sentences from imprisonment. In addition, there are serious signs of de-skilling still going on. The percentage of oral fast delivery reports in the magistrates' courts increased by an astonishing more than 1,000% between 2005 and 2010. Probation service officers, who are not fully qualified probation officers, now make up around half of main grade probation staff. And OASIS, the offender assessment system, could easily be used by non-qualified staff. Government is currently loosening up national standards. At one time, this might have been cause for celebration, but at the present time, it smacks of easing the way for non-probation providers to move into the community sentences field without being regulated too much. Now, all of these storms, I think, might just about have been weathered. But the first speech by the new Justice Secretary, Kenneth following the election in 2010, where he talked about a rehabilitation revolution, conspicuously failed to mention the probation service. And I think that was a highly significant omission. Since then, it's been downhill all the way. In January of this year, the government published a consultation document with a lovely title, Transforming Rehabilitation. And while the use of the word rehabilitation might seem to be rather favourable to probation, this isn't the case. The key term here is transforming, not rehabilitation. The government's proposals, essentially, are to introduce supervision on release from custody for those who get less than 12 months imprisonment, that the vast majority of offenders with community sentences will be dealt with by contracted providers, payment by results, every community order to have a punitive element, yet another structural change from 35 probation trusts to 16 contract package areas, and probation to retain responsibility only for risk assessment, court reports, and the supervision of high-risk offenders. Now, these proposals have been widely criticised, and rightly so, and I'm only going to comment on them very briefly. Compulsory supervision for those sentenced to less than 12 months custody is clearly a positive step, but it will be very expensive. Custody Plus, the same thing that was introduced in the 2003 Criminal Justice Act, was shelved indefinitely for cost reasons. And a better approach might have been to simply try to restrict sentencers' ability to pass short sentences. Introducing contracted providers from the private and voluntary sectors raises issues of fragmentation, of expertise, of conflicts of interest, of inconsistent practice. All of them serious issues. Payment by results is a minefield, partly because the binary measure that's proposed, reconviction or not reconviction, is much too simplistic, partly because the question of which agency is going to be paid for success, no matter how that's measured, remains unresolved, and partly because it could lead to cherry picking. The proposal to have a punitive element in every community order is yet another example of the increasingly punitive culture we live in. Community sentences generally have been forced along this route for more than 20 years now, and there's no evidence whatsoever that being punitive improves the success rate of a court sentence. Interestingly enough, the consultation document follows this idea with the claim that community orders will achieve even greater levels of rehabilitation, which certainly suggests to me that somebody's not been thinking very hard about how being punitive fits with being rehabilitative. The planned change to 16 areas seems to be solely for the benefit of potential contractors, rather than for the commissioning of effective services for offenders, while a national commissioning model is likely to result in only large private companies winning the contracts. Finally, leaving probation to be responsible for risk assessment, court reports, and the supervision of high-risk offenders will only increase bureaucracy, assumes that close working relationships will be built quickly and effectively between contracted providers and the probation service, which there's very little evidence of that happening in the past, and it ignores all the grey areas of risk assessment. For example, high-risk and medium-risk people, close overlap there, and in fact, risk can change over time. There's very scant evidence indeed to support any of these proposals, and in the absence of this, it seems clear that ideology is the driving force. If these proposals are actually implemented, it's likely that probation will lose around 70% of its work. And if this happens, we'll have seen the end of the probation service. And not just that, but the gains that have been made over the past 30 years, whereby a fragmented collection of services with a wide variety of working practices and organisational structures became a coherent, organised and reasonably effective national criminal justice agency, will all have been negated. It is, of course, possible that the government's proposals will not be fully put into practice, but it seems to me that that's only postponing what's going to be inevitable. The probation service has been pushed down the wrong path since Michael Howard proclaimed that prison works in 1993. And if we look at the conditions David Garland argued some years ago, conditions that underpinned the penal welfare compromise that characterises much of the 20th century, and probation is the key exemplar of this penal welfare compromise, then it looks depressingly likely that there's no way back. Where today, for example, do we see any signs that any one of these conditions exist? Governance associated with social democratic politics and a civic narrative of inclusion. High levels of informal social inclusion imposed by families, communities, schools, and employment. An economic context based on Keynesianism. The authority of social expertise provided by social workers, psychiatrists, and the like. The support of social elites for the ethos of penal welfarism. Perceived validity and effectiveness, and the absence of any active public or political opposition. I find it very difficult to see any of those existing in any meaningful way. The probation service is a small organisation, and it's not surprising that the general public has little idea of its significance. It's been seriously underappreciated during its 106 years of existence. The service itself has contributed to this situation by ignoring or misreading significant political developments. Government has never quite known what to do with the service, And it's all too easy to make it the whipping boy for criminal justice. It's small, and it lacks the power and authority of the police or the prison service. Government policy towards the service has been badly planned and poorly implemented consistently over the years. What is new is the current government's overt hostility towards probation and its desire to introduce market imperatives to working with offenders in the community, a desire that's misplaced and fundamentally fails to understand how probation works. We're all actually implicit in what's been going on, the public, the government, and the probation service itself. It's almost 100 years ago that T.S. Eliot published one of the key works of literary modernism, and by the time the centenary of the Wasteland celebrated in 9 years' time, the probation service may well have disappeared. If this is the case, then we'll certainly be in a penal wasteland, and that would be a 21st century tragedy. The probation service has been the civilizing influence in our criminal justice system, and without it, we face a very bleak future. Thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure, as the Dean of Sciences and Social Sciences at the University, to thank you, Professor Mair, our new Professor of Criminology, for your detailed and engaging presentation. My response to your inaugural lecture, in this month particularly, is timely, given that a new wave of changes have just come into being that will impact on society. Your talk this evening has exposed us to another side of society that, thankfully, most of us in this room have not experienced. It has outlined for many of us the numerous issues that surround the relatively new concept of a probation service, one we have quickly come to accept as a normal part of the criminal justice system, but one in which, as you point out, may have no long-term future. You alluded to the fact that it has no effective political voice, nor any way of answering the key question of effectiveness. Our current political climate makes this a dangerous environment for any public service. Governments like things they can easily measure. Quantifying is, of course, a difficulty in any area of social science. We have, this last few weeks, seen a more refined categorization of the famous "that was the week that was" sketch. We were quite happy with upper, middle, and lower class. We've had many nuances added to that. My sense is that we're in danger of reverting to the American model of rich or poor as our societal differences increase. However, the general public, to whom all politicians must ultimately answer, like to have people put into boxes that are easily understandable. This does not, of course, help us to solve, or in most cases, better understand the richness that qualitative research, the bedrock of the social sciences, provides. But if the probation service is to survive, then it needs to quickly resolve these issues. An additional challenge to the criminal justice system is that good intentions lead often to unexpected consequences. We've just had other groups added to the hate crime category. Apparently goths are now included. I think that's someone dressed in black. This adds to a number of associated hate crime labels: ethnic minorities, homosexuals, disabilities, Muslims. Now, you may try in vain to explain to a policeman, the first contact for the vast majority of the public with the criminal justice system, that you did not simply like them, or more sadly, you did not like her. And that is why you assaulted them. However, if the victim is one of these increasingly large hate categories, this is going to be difficult. You are likely to be charged with a hate crime. Ironically, surely you'd have to hate somebody to hit them in the first place. The probation officer will then need to deal with someone who could be innocent of a hate crime and simply guilty of disliking somebody. As pointed out, if this is compounded by the offender, now more known as a client, being a juvenile, how will they deal with this unintentional consequence? The lack of locality in the probation service adds yet an additional dimension of complexity. A borough of London, with its localised teenage gangs and associated stabbings, alongside a lack of opportunity, is totally different to the more affluent and privileged teenage issues in Heswell, for example, which are more likely to be drug rather than poverty-related. Your talk has focused on initiatives, a wonderful, crafted piece of political spin that allows politicians to ease out of policy decisions that have failed. Sadly, this increased use of initiative was driven by the last Labour government. This also increases the pressure on probation officers. And also, unfortunately, the less fortunate members of society, where social and personal costs can be significant. You wisely raise the question of effectiveness, not efficiency. Two different things. For this service, it must now be seen externally as an effective service, not merely efficient if it's to survive. But is this possible? Would an offender be less likely to re-offend if he or she had been supported for 5 months instead of, say, 7 months? Transforming rehabilitation is now a key theme, as you point out. Would an offender who commits only one more crime on release be more transformed if he committed 3? These are quantifiable, but not really help the majority of the public to understand that a committed probation officer has in fact managed to reduce criminal output from 3 to 1 offence. As our new professor points out, the service is doing a public good. Their challenge is to convince the government that this is so. I'm proud, though, to verify that our new professor of criminal justice is at the forefront of this debate and will help our students leave hope with a clearer understanding, in a real sense, of our faculty mission statement, and that is to produce graduates who positively contribute to society. This hope theme is now being taken up by other universities who recognise that this is a public responsibility, particularly in the social sciences. In his new book, Professor John Brewer, who was the former president of the British Sociology Association, states that we are about producing citizens for the 21st century, not factory-like graduates with 2 1s. This indeed is yours and Hope's view. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, you would have noticed that after the lecture was given and Professor May sat down, the light got better. And I thought it was a good omen of what we hope will happen with the chair being now filled by our distinguished professor. And this new Department of Social Science, which will house criminal justice, sociology, and criminology, that there will be a great vision outlined, of course, in the lecture for what our students will be exposed to. Now, it's at this point in the inaugural ceremony that we call the lecturer forward and make a presentation. Professor Mair, please come forward. To remember the evening and the title of the lecture, congratulations again. Well, Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's been lovely to have you at the university. Thank you very much.